It was supposed to be one of those weekends you look forward to for months. A quiet cabin tucked in the woods, a chance to unplug, breathe fresh air, and just enjoy some peace. I had packed up everything, ready for a couple of days with no work. No distractions, just calm. But as soon as I arrived, I realized peace wasn't on the schedule. Because standing at the end of my driveway, arms crossed and scowl ready, was someone I had hoped never to deal with again. The HOA's self-appointed enforcer. The one everyone in the neighborhood quietly calls Karen. Now, I don't mind following the rules when they make sense, but Karen? She doesn't just enforce rules, she makes them up as she goes. And on this particular weekend, she had already decided my cabin wasn't mine to enjoy. With that all too familiar entitled tone, she announced that she had planned to use my cabin for her weekend getaway. She didn't ask, she didn't suggest, she demanded. Like my property was some kind of community rental she could just claim whenever she felt like it. At first, I honestly thought she was joking. But when I laughed it off, her face turned red, and that's when the real fireworks started. She began pacing, waving her hands, insisting she had every right to be there. And when I calmly told her no, that's when the situation spiraled. She pulled out her phone, threatening to handle this officially. I thought she might call the HOA board. Maybe throw in a nasty email. But no, Karen went one step further. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared down the road. She had called the cops. All because I refused to hand over my own cabin. And that was just the beginning. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the trees, breaking the calm of the forest night. My heart sank, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I knew exactly how far Karen was willing to go to get her way. The idea that she would call the police over something as ridiculous as claiming my cabin was both unbelievable and, somehow, exactly what I should have expected from her. See, this wasn't the first time she had pulled something like this. Ever since I bought the cabin, she had been looking for ways to remind me that the HOA ran things in this community. From little notes left on my door about where I parked, to her telling me that my deck lights didn't match the aesthetic. Karen always had something to say. Most neighbors just tried to avoid her, but I always suspected she had her eye on my place for some reason. The cabin sits on a quiet stretch with one of the best views of the lake. Maybe that's what she wanted all along as I stood there watching the patrol car slow to a stop. I could hear Karen rehearsing her story under her breath, ready to make herself look like the victim. Her tone shifted the moment the officer stepped out suddenly. She was sweet, polite, even fragile. She spun the tale like she had been wronged, like I had somehow locked her out of a place she had reserved. The more she talked, the more it became clear that she had actually convinced herself of her own version of events. The officer glanced at me, then back at her, clearly trying to piece together what was going on. My cabin, her claim, the HOA rules. It was all about to get a whole lot messier. The officer stood there with his notepad, clearly unsure what he had just walked into. On one side was Karen, acting like she had every legal right to be at my cabin. On the other side was me, standing on my own porch, holding the keys, and wondering how on earth this had turned into a police call. She pointed at me with exaggerated hand motions, going on about community agreements and her scheduled weekend. The more she talked, the more dramatic she became, even pulling out a printed HOA pamphlet as if that somehow overruled my deed. I could tell the officer was trying to stay neutral, but I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes. He asked for proof, and that's when things got even stranger. Karen pulled out her phone and scrolled furiously, claiming she had an email confirming her right to the property. She held the screen up triumphantly, but from where I stood, it looked more like a reminder from the HOA about a community barbecue. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. Why was she so determined to use my cabin? Was it really just about control, or was there something else behind it? I remembered overhearing a neighbor once mention that Karen's relatives were visiting soon. And suddenly, her obsession with my place started to make a twisted kind of sense. My cabin wasn't just a quiet getaway, was the crown jewel of the neighborhood, and she wanted to show it off as if it were hers. The officer cleared his throat, clearly about to ask more questions, but Karen cut him off with another dramatic claim. She leaned in, lowered her voice, and hinted there were other issues with my ownership. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about one weekend. It was something much bigger. The air felt heavier with every passing second as the officer tried to get a straight answer out of both of us. Karen's voice grew louder, more desperate, as if volume alone could make her story true. She clutched that HOA pamphlet like it was some kind of legal contract, pointing at random sentences that had nothing to do with property rights. I stayed calm, but inside, I was boiling. It wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about someone trying to rewrite reality to fit their own entitlement. The officer finally asked me to step aside so he could speak to her privately. I agreed, but I stood close enough to hear snippets of their conversation. That's when Karen dropped her biggest accusation yet. She claimed I hadn't followed proper HOA procedures when I bought the cabin. According to her, the purchase was never approved by the board, and therefore, I wasn't the rightful owner. My jaw nearly hit the ground. Not only was that completely false, but it was also a dangerous claim to make in front of law enforcement. As the officer scribbled notes, I noticed lights flicking on from the neighboring cabins. A few curious neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, whispering to each other, watching the scene unfold like it was some late-night drama. Their presence only seemed to fuel Karen's performance. She straightened her posture, raised her voice even higher, and started framing herself as the one protecting the community from an outsider. The tension hit a breaking point when the officer turned toward me, his face unreadable. He asked me to produce my paperwork, deed ID, proof of ownership, anything to show that the cabin was legally mine. My hands tightened around the keys. In my pocket, this was it. Everything was coming to a head, and the next few moments would decide whether reason won out, or if Karen's meltdown would actually succeed. I pulled out my folder from the car, the one where I always keep important documents, and handed the officer the deed and my ID. He studied them carefully, nodding, and for a moment I thought the nightmare was almost over. But then Karen stepped forward with a smug grin, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. She announced that the HOA president himself was on the way, and that once he arrived, he would confirm her version of the story. My stomach dropped. The last thing I needed was for this to turn into a circus with more people piling in. But within minutes, headlights appeared at the edge of the driveway. Sure enough, it was the HOA president's truck. He got out slowly, adjusting his glasses, looking equal parts annoyed and curious. Karen immediately rushed over to him, talking so fast it was hard to even understand her, painting me as some trespasser squatting in her weekend cabin. The officer glanced between us, clearly weighing what he should do next. The neighbors leaned in closer, whispering, eager to see if Karen's story would actually hold up. That's when the twist landed, because instead of siding with me or Karen, the HOA president pulled out his phone and revealed he had received a string of complaints about my cabin earlier that week. Anonymous complaints. He wouldn't say from who, but it wasn't hard to guess. Suddenly, this wasn't just a dispute over who got to stay for the weekend. It had escalated into a full-blown investigation of whether my cabin was even in compliance with HOA rules. Karen folded her arms, smirking like she had already won. And standing there, surrounded by flashing lights, accusing voices, and watchful neighbors, I realized I was fighting more than just her demands. I was fighting a campaign to take my place away entirely. The officer flipped through my deed again while the HOA president scrolled through his phone. reading out the so-called complaints. They were vague, things like improper use of property and unauthorized guests. Nothing that even remotely suggested I was breaking any rules. I finally spoke up, my voice steady but firm, and reminded everyone that I had bought the cabin outright, that my deed was legally recorded, and that the HOA had no authority to take ownership away. The officer nodded slowly, and for the first time that night, I saw his expression harden in my favor. Karen, though, wasn't ready to back down. She started shouting over me, her voice cracking as she insisted the cabin wasn't his to begin with. She turned to the HOA president for backup, but instead of agreeing, he let out a heavy sigh. He told her, right there in front of everyone, that she had crossed a line. The complaints had all come from the same email address, and it didn't take long for him to admit they traced back to her. The neighbors gasped, "Okay?" And I could see the officer's patience snap. Karen's face went pale as the officer told her she had wasted police time and created a false report. The smugness was gone, replaced by panic. I thought that would be the end of it, but then came the twist. The HOA president, after scolding her, turned to me and said quietly, "But we do need to talk about something else with your cabin. Something serious." Everyone froze. Karen had been caught, but now the attention swung back to me. The neighbors whispered. The officer waited, and the president's words hung heavy in the air. The conflict with Karen was over, but suddenly, a new mystery had opened when I hadn't seen coming. The president's words stopped everyone cold. For a second, I thought Karen might actually be right about something, but then he explained. The serious issue had nothing to do with ownership or rules. It was about safety, apparently during a recent inspection of nearby properties. They noticed that my cabin's deck railing was out of compliance with updated codes. Nothing illegal, nothing that meant I couldn't live there, but something that would need fixing before the HOA closed its file. The officer relaxed as soon as he heard it, and the tension that had filled the night finally broke. Neighbors chuckled under their breath, realizing that all of Karen's theatrics had boiled down to a simple maintenance issue. I couldn't help but laugh myself. After everything, police lights, accusations, false reports, turned out that only problem was a railing that needed a few nails and fresh wood. Karen, meanwhile, had no comeback left. The officer warned her sternly about filing false complaints and wasting police resources. And the HOA president made it clear she had lost any credibility in the community. She stormed off into the night, muttering about how nobody ever appreciated her hard work, but the damage to her reputation was done, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the officer drove away. I stood on my porch, keys still in hand, finally able to breathe again. My weekend of peace had turned into a spectacle, but in a strange way, it revealed a lot. Karen's control was broken. My neighbors had seen the truth for themselves. And the HOA president, for once, seemed more like an ally than an enemy. In the end, the cabin was still mine, the lake view still stretched wide, and the quiet I came for had finally returned. Sometimes, the best victory is simply standing your ground.